So, welcome, and I apologize for our pipe noise, which engineering is attempting to solve, but we may have a bass in the background of our discussions for this morning until they figure out exactly why one of the pipes has decided to make noise. Most likely, it's just heating related to the boiler and its expansion, so you don't have to worry that something's going to come bursting out of the wall or something. At least they assure me of that, and they're engineers, so it's a One Health thing. Engineers are good. We're supposed to collaborate with all of our colleagues. So I'm Dr. Weiss. I am the co-director of the Global Health Center. This is the application of the One Health approach to global health centers. Dr. Akkar, Jacqueline Akkar is over there, is a co-director of the Einstein Global Health Center. Jill Ralphman in the back is the associate director. Our partners in this conference are EcoHealth Alliance. Catherine is sitting in the front, and Dr. Koresh, I don't think he's here. I think he's on a plane somewhere. Was also involved in this, and this is at the Einstein Montefiore Center. So a couple of housekeeping things. One, there's this funny little card in the back, which is an attendance card. Please fill it out. You'll get credit without it, but it needs to be filled out. There's a pile of them at the front desk. In terms of claiming credit for this meeting, inside that blue folder you'll find instructions about the EEDS system, which is an electronic system. The only fine point is if you are a speaker, this is 11.5 credit hours, but if you're a speaker, it's 11 because the assumption is you gave a talk and you're not allowed to double dip and talk and claim credit for listening to yourself. It is funny. Nothing like fine. Nothing like. I am merely Vanna White. I am the messenger. I'm just telling you. All right. And a couple of other minor housekeeping issues. Today's exciting in that we're having some technology talks, and we've moved them together in the morning. So we're going to start up in space, looking down at One Health, and then we're going to talk about how to take 21st century technology into the field to categorize insects and understand dynamics as opposed to putting out graduate students as bait to catch the insects. From there, we're going to go to a different sort of curriculum, which is how do we take this One Health curriculum, or how do we take these ideas about One Health, and how do we train people in One Health or get interested? And we had a little preview of that yesterday in terms of some standards that have been developed, and certainly you can go where those standards are. CUGH has lots of standards as well for global health, and I think, Dr. Martin, is there anything on One Health in the CUGH standards that have been done?
Funny enough, I don't know if Jessica Ebert is here. Jessica, are you here? So we have a competencies subcommittee on education, and we'll be working with Jessica and others to be able to acquire One Health competencies and integrate that and share that widely. So that's upcoming. So it's a great question, Louis. The other thing is we've got competencies in global health in both graduate and undergraduate. We've pulled out, and lastly, the ASP PH.D. American Schools and Programs of Public Health have standards and competencies in public health, and those will be shared shortly. Those have been shared actually.
Right.
It's a longer answer.
No, it's actually the sort of answer that I wanted, because this is really what the afternoon is going to be, to some, not the afternoon, but the second half of the talks here. So I was charged talking about and summarizing yesterday, because there's going to be things that come out of this, and we all heard about One Health, which is a big area, an approach to thinking about things, which I think is probably the better way of thinking about One Health. And it's an approach that, despite having, and that has been, let's see if we can get this going, that has been around for a long time. and which is not to take from the definition of One Health and the first time the term came, but I'd like to point you to, since I'm an infectious disease person, an old quote from Virchow, who you may remember as one of those sort of giants of infectious disease from the earlier centuries, is that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. Medicine as a social science, is the science of human beings, has the obligation to point out problems and to attempt their theoretical solution. The politician, the practical anthropologist, must find the means for their actual solution. And I only put this up because one of the things that came out, and one of the things that I think is important, is that idea of engagement. I think everyone who is here has already engagement in the sense that you've bought in, or you're at least interested in One Health, to the point where I'm going to go to a One Health conference and learn more about it. But one of the other aspects is an advocacy out, both to the generation we're educating as well as to the public in terms of understanding what One Health is and how one goes about integrating large and diverse sums of data. So for those of you that weren't here yesterday, the other points before I introduce the first speaker are we do indeed have Wi-Fi access if you need it. And if you look for where Einstein is part of the Montefiore Healthcare Network, and if you look, you'll see Montefiore Guest. You can sign on. You don't need a password. And also, for those of you that like to tweet, we do indeed have a hashtag, which I always forget, so let me look at it. It's, for this meeting, it's hashtag EinsteinOH2018. So feel free to tweet and join us. The place where I took this quote from, obviously, is way past when Virchow wrote. With that, let me introduce the first speaker who can come up here, and what we're going to do is we're going to have our Nasser colleague, Dr. Anyamba, talk, and then we're going to have Dr. Pintea talk.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to Catherine and Jill for inviting me to this small conference. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here. I didn't know Einstein School of Medicine exists. Now I know. You learn something every day. So what I'm going to do today, I'm hopefully going to expose to you to the fact that we can actually use sensing technology from space to be able to look at particular issues regarding diseases that have a One Health focus. So to start off, I'm sure many of you have seen this iconic image from space. And basically, to me, what it tells me that we are one. And we are no more important than the elephants or the centipede. Basically, if you are out there from the vantage point where this image was taken from, you don't see any human beings. So everything that is on the surface of the earth is equally important, despite the fact that we privilege ourselves and we are the most transformational force on the surface of the earth. So from that, I'll tell you that we take images from space, but in order to understand how the actual Earth system works, we have to take measurements using different technologies, for example, to measure sea surface temperatures that are very important elements in determining weather systems around the world. We also have measurements of precipitation. So it tells you something about the hydrological cycle. We now also have measurements of the land surface temperature, which tells you about what land surface conditions are like. And then from the lab in which I work at Goddard, we compile measurements of vegetation. And if you take all these measurements together, you can begin to see how you can look at dynamics of plant and animal life and the emergence of diseases. So to do that, we look at various forms of variability. We have seasonal variability, we have interannual variability, We have long-term trends. But in my work, one thing that we focus on is something called El Nino Southern Oscillation. And I'm sure many of you have heard about El Nino Southern Oscillation. What you see here is the indicator of this El Nino globally, and this is from the signature event. This was in 1997-98. This was the El Nino of the century. And that is marked by this warming here in the Eastern Equatorial Pacific. Now, the most important thing to understand is because of the sheer size of the Pacific Ocean, once you change temperature gradients here, either warming or cooling, by a matter of degrees, you are actually going to affect weather patterns around the globe. And you can see that by, if you take measurements using another instrument where we look at cloudiness, this is outgoing long-wave radiation, you can see that in those areas where you have warmer than normal sea surface temperatures, you tend to have colder conditions and precipitating clouds. So you have a lot of rainfall. And in areas where you have colder than normal sea surface temperature, you tend to have high outgoing radiation, which is an indicator of drought. So you have this seesaw pattern in these conditions. The other element to remember about this, although the effect of the Southern Oscillation and El Nino is mostly around the tropics, because you are changing these massive weather systems around the tropics, they end up also influencing what is happening in the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see that from this map of precipitation anomalies during an El Nino event. So you can see Eastern Africa tends to get wetter, Southeast Asia tends to be drier, Eastern Pacific, Peru and Ecuador tend to be wetter, and the southern tier of the United States, Florida, Texas, and some areas in the southeast, including California, tend to get wetter than normal during El Nino events. As I would say, these variations in weather on an international time scale have an effect of basically reorganizing vector-borne disease landscapes, because these conditions at either end have an effect on the emergence, increase in population of disease vectors, and their propagation. And what we have learned from doing this work over the last couple of years is that different conditions basically favor different vectors. So under drier than normal conditions, you will have emergence of vectors, for example, that support dengue, chikungunya, and Zika. And under conditions of very wet conditions, you have emergence of vectors that drive, for example, Rift Valley fever, plague, and hantavirus. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to use the disease called Rift Valley fever, which Mindy talked about yesterday. I will not go much about this because Mindy talked a lot about Rift Valley fever yesterday in terms of the introduction. But I'll say that it is an example of a really One Health problem, because Rift Valley fever is a crossover pathogen affecting both human beings and livestock. It is of importance to biosecurity and biodefense. The other thing is the impact on livelihoods, especially if you think about is where Rift Valley fever outbreaks are usually happen is mainly in semi-arid areas where people don't have much in terms of resources, but livestock is an important resource in these areas. So if you look at, for example, the outbreaks in Southern Africa during the 2010 outbreak and in East Africa in 2006-07, the estimated economic damage is on the order of $200 million just during those periods. So it is really an important disease. The other thing is, even though there is a vaccine for animals or livestock, there is no vaccine for human beings. There are many issues regarding that. Maybe the industry doesn't want to invest in a disease that occurs only occasionally every several years. However, even with vaccination, if you look at small-scale farmers, this tends to be prohibitive for them. So probably the thing we can do is to figure out how to do prevention, and prevention involves early warning. These are just some statistics of the losses that have occurred because of Rift Valley fever. You can see the figures here. The big one I would say is in 1977 and 78 in Egypt, where you had about 200,000 estimated cases. Also, when it happened in the past, countries that don't control Rift Valley fever will often face a trade ban from OIE. So you are talking about further diminishing their the income earning potential. If you think about should the Rift Valley fever come to the U.S., the estimates of the cost will be between 500 million and $1 billion. We already have vectors here that can transmit Rift Valley fever. So part of doing this work is to understand how the outbreaks dynamics happen in areas where it is adapted to, in order to understand if it were ever to come here, how can we be able to deal with it. Mindy had shown this graphic here. This is some work we did with Ken Linthicum way back in 1999, when we actually found out outbreaks of Rift Valley fever. About 95% of them since 1950 are driven by this variation in El Nino Southern Oscillation. The one thing that Mindy didn't mention yesterday is that there is actually this dipole pattern in the effects. And the dipole pattern shows that in East Africa, you'll tend to have outbreaks during the El Nino period when it's wetter than normal. And then during the La Nina period, when temperatures are colder than normal in the Eastern Pacific, you tend to have above normal rainfall in Eastern Africa, in Southern Africa. So you tend to have a cluster of outbreaks in Southern Africa during this period. And this is reflected in the patterns of outbreaks pattern. So you can see the main centers of the disease outbreak are in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. And that is basically controlled by variations driven by El Nino Southern Oscillation. Just regarding some few points regarding these measurements or climate measurements, as I mentioned earlier on, different temperature extremes have an effect on the survival of vectors, also including precipitation. When you have above normal precipitation or lower than normal precipitation, you tend to form different habitats for these vectors. And basically, by being able to capture the dynamics of variations in these climate measurements, we can be able to infer populations of vectors. So how do we go about this? This is some work that Ken Linthicum did in Kenya in the early 80s. And basically what it showed that in a dumbo is a habitat like this one where the vectors of Rift Valley fever emerge. When they artificially flooded that dumbo, they had this mosquito succession. So there are 80 species which are the primary vectors that carry the virus. They transmit this to the animals. And then the Culex species are the secondary vectors. They are very efficient at transmitting the disease from animals to human beings. So you can imagine an area that combined the size of Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico, flooding for several months. And all of those areas have this particular kind of habitats. So you can imagine in a 3-month period, how many vectors are you going to produce? That is why understanding these extremes is very important. So you basically can think about replicating this graph over millions of hectares of land And in those conditions is when you create conditions for an outbreak. So how do we go about this? The important thing is having time series measurements. And as I mentioned, the important thing that drives the abundance of vectors, especially in epidemic or episodic conditions, is having persistent anomalous conditions. So these two graphics here illustrate to you basically what kind of technique we use. The important thing is to have consistent measurements over a long time and then be able to calculate anomalies from those. So you can see here in this graphic, you can see, for example, these areas that are brown are areas of drought, persistent drought, and during those periods, you have higher than normal land surface temperatures. On the other hand, areas that are green indicate areas that are moist for persistently over several months. Those periods tend to be cooler than normal. And these conditions, both dry and wet, will support different kind of vectors. The Rift Valley fever vectors will favor these conditions, where it is greener than normal, wetter than normal, and cooler conditions. So we use this kind of technique to understand the anomalies on the landscape. And basically what we have done is to come up with a model. This model takes into consideration where Rift Valley fever has occurred in the past, which is the green area. We call it the potential episodic area. So when we run the model, we are focusing on these particular areas. Okay, and this is basically formed by thresholding these climate measurements, looking at outbreak history, and then establishing this. So we run the model in this way. We have measurements, say, from this month, and then we have a long-term mean of this month, and then we get anomalies. These anomalies are fed into this model. It's basically a persistent model. It basically measures thresholds that we think that we have established will be thresholds that meet areas that are potential for vectors to emerge. And then every month, we produce maps like this. So we have maps of rainfall, and this can be daily or 10 days. And then at the end of every month, we produce a risk map. This example here shows you, for example, early in the spring, there was an outbreak in Eastern Africa, and the black dots show you where the outbreaks happened. You can see that there were some outbreaks that happened outside our episodic area. So basically, this is posing a new question to us. You know, is the range of the vectors more than we have thought before? Or is this a new establishment of this disease in a new area in southeastern Uganda? We have done that for the entire continent, and you can see here outbreaks from 2006 to 2011. What we found out from our work is that we had very good model performance in Eastern Africa, but not so in Southern Africa, and I'll come to this later on. We had about 50% hits for outbreaks in Sudan. You can ask me then, so if you had this model, why is it that outbreaks happened? That is because, just because you communicate information, government systems or bureaucracies are not so quickly to turn around their ship and respond to a particular disaster. However, what I can mention that during the 2006-7 outbreak in Eastern Africa, the response was actually 2 months earlier than it was in 1997-98. Okay, so that is obviously an improvement, and I'll show you some advances that we have made recently. So here you can see for the case of Kenya, Tanzania, and Sudan, the red line shows you when we first made the early warning, and then this is the epidemiological curve of when how the outbreak proceeded during that particular period. And you can see that, for example, Kenya, we have about 3 to 4 months of early warning, okay? In Tanzania, we have about 5 months. And Sudan, we have about 5 months. In Southern Africa, we have about 3 months. So this is obviously an opportunity to undertake preventive measures. I would say vaccination should probably happen 4 months before. but there are things that can be done in terms of public education, in terms of handling dead carcasses of animals or not consuming milk from sick cows, and also just general awareness of the information of the public regarding the outbreak. Now, we came up with this particular timeline graphic that I think Billy showed yesterday. Basically, if you are able to provide early warning, the most important thing is to do mass vaccination. Okay, you can do mass vaccination or vector control. If you do that, you are going to basically minimize the amplification of the virus in the livestock population. And if you do that, you are going to cut off transmission to human beings, or actually minimize it. And I'll show a good example of that just later on. So how do we share our information? This is our One Health approach, and in the meeting about last week, I mentioned to Billy that I have been doing this work for about 20 years. I've been doing One Health approach without knowing I was doing it, but now I know. So our first customer, because this work is funded by the Department of Defense, is we send the information out to Department of Defense. This is basically for force health protection. We have our men and women deployed in many of these areas. We have people who are traveling in these areas, so they have to know what is the risk posture in terms of disease outbreak in these areas. But more importantly, we also share information with the USDA because they need to take care of homeland defense in terms of inspection at the border. For example, if their ship was coming in from South Africa and you know that there's an outbreak happening in there, you have to pay more attention in terms of inspecting the cargo from that ship. And then, more importantly, we share information also with the FAO, which is in charge of taking care of livestock health. We share information with the WHO in terms of human health, and then also with OIE because they regulate livestock trade. So in this case, for me, I have achieved my One Health aim or approach in terms of sharing information with the important actors in the field. Also, what we do is we send these maps out in terms of Google Maps to various partner governments in order for them to do targeted surveillance, because when they have these kind of maps, they will find out exactly what spot on the ground they need to do surveillance. Early surveillance is important because if you know the virus is circulating there, you can be able to undertake measures for prevention. Now, a good example of this work in action, so I talked about 2006, 2007, where I said the outbreak happened, but the response was 2 months earlier than 1997-98. If you look at the situation in 2015-16, when there was another, when the conditions were set for another outbreak, we had a meeting over in Djibouti with OIE and WHO and FAO. We invited all ministries of health, ministries of agriculture to that meeting, and we gave a warning about this. Information actually filtered to the ground, and this is one farm where we work at in Kenya. You can see here that the vectors of Rift Valley fever emerged, but what this farm did, they did early vaccination. So when we ended up going there in March 2016, unlike in 2007, when they lost about 80% of their livestock herd, in 2015-16, they didn't lose anything because they did early vaccination. So you can see the impact of this kind of work. Now, I mentioned about South Africa where we didn't have very good performance. This one actually led us to write this proposal together with Billy, which is focused more on a One Health approach. And this is going on. I'm sure Billy mentioned a little bit about that, and also Mindy mentioned about that. But the important thing about this project is bringing all these actors together, or people involved in that. So we are doing work on livestock. We are also working in sampling wildlife. We are doing laboratory work. I'm doing the work supporting all the climate analysis. And then also we go to the field and collect vectors. So this is a very good example of putting together a project in a World Health approach where everybody knows what is their buy-in in order to achieve one aim of preventing the spread and emergence of these diseases. The one thing I would like to mention is that we can apply this to other diseases. For example, West Nile. If you look at the outbreak we had, or the epidemic we had of West Nile fever in the US in 2011, 2012, when we begin to look at data and interrogate it, we realize that this period was actually during the big North American drought during that period. So there is a signal indicating that West Nile fever vectors may be highly adaptable to drier conditions. The story may be a little bit longer there to explain, but it basically indicates that when we have these booms of West Nile fever continentally in the US may be related to drier conditions. And also we see that, for example, in Australia with Murray Valley fever. So there are many particular diseases that this work can be extended to. Of course, there is also always an X factor. And I will not talk much about this, but you all know about the globalization. Since the humans have been inhabited the planet Earth, we always move around, but the speed of movement has now increased, both in marine traffic and in air transport. And basically this means that we are not alone, even here, and we are not so far away from a disease happening elsewhere that could be eventually end up where you live. So this is something that we always have to pay attention, and I think is importance of basically doing work in global health and One Health, because it's understanding what is going on in other places that you can be able to manage particular biological threats. So I'll end up, there are some points there, you can read them, but the important thing I want to point out, there are large amounts of satellite remote sensing data that are available from the US government that are available for anybody for use both here and around the world to address some of these issues. Because as we realize, some of these issues cannot be solved by only a particular group of people. So I would like to thank our collaborators and funders, DITRA and the Defense Health Agency, and collaborators, EcoHealth, and also the partner governments we work with, FAO, OIE, and the entire international community. Thank you very much.
One of the advantages of starting just a little bit early was that way we could have a few questions here as we go. So are there any questions before we move to the next speaker?
So I'm just curious about where you get your surveillance data. You say that you notify like WHO, and then they know where to look for cases, or is there some other like more broad surveillance?
This is in terms of early surveillance, because all we are doing is we are looking for environmental indicators, and we have a record of where outbreaks have occurred in the past. Our data comes from OIE. They provide a good service. And I will just mention we are also getting data from Larry Madoff's PROMED system. So those are very important resources for being able to model diseases. So we build our model based on, first, the history, and also, as I showed, on the dynamics of the vectors. Though if you look at, in terms of the work that has been done in vectors for Rift Valley fever, it's very limited. So our model is basically based on that population dynamics that I showed from Kenya. We are attempting to do that now in Southern Africa, but we need more examples of this. But I think that in this kind of area, if you you need to use satellite information. You basically have to understand the basic biology of the vectors and the pathogens in order to be able to link that to satellite information.
So it's like targeted based on
Yeah.
theory and modeling.
Yeah.
And would you catch, like if there was an outbreak somewhere that hadn't been predicted, unexpected?
Well, like I showed in this particular map from early this year, we see now outbreaks happening in Uganda. That is in an area that we have had no reports. It is not in our green area or the episodic area. So that is basically stimulating to ask other questions. Is this an expansion of the range of the vectors? Or is it a different ecosystem where the vectors have become adapted to? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, hello, good morning. Rafael Ruiz de Castañeda from Faculty of Medicine, University of Geneva. I think this is an excellent talk and an excellent case study illustrating that with the good integration of data, as you illustrated, we can actually, at least for some diseases, we can improve our capacity to predict, and it's always so complex.
Yeah.
My question is, you mainly focused on the Kenyan story and the South African one.
Yeah.
But what about in your African map? You also showed this Mauritania area.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? What type of work you're doing there? Are you planning to do? This is an area I know quite well, and I think it's quite an interesting environment there. So what about Mauritania?
Yeah, actually, if I go back to this, let me see. If I go back to this graphic here, when we run our model, we actually run it continentally. We subset different regions for different customers. So we actually, if you look at, for example, in Mauritania, we had this outbreak in 2010 that is outside this green area. However, other outbreaks that have happened have been in this green area. This is more a complicated story because what I've heard from our collaborators from FAO is basically this area here. There was rain extended outside of what I call the proper Sahelian zone, and livestock herders basically transported their cattle to these particular areas. So it seems that there is a rift there, so long as their conditions are appropriate, which may only be every couple of years. But it's a complicated story to do with the livestock transport, livestock trade, and livestock routes of trading. Thank you.
So, on from remote sensing in the sky to sensing on the environment, Dr. Pintea is going to talk about robots and chimpanzees.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to be here and share with you some of our work on One Health approach. My name is Lilian Pintea. I'm the Vice President of Conservation Science of the Jane Goodall Institute, USA. And I'm presenting this work with my colleagues in the Gombe Stream Research Center in Tanzania, and also with our colleagues and providers of and developers of technology from the Microsoft Research. In the 1960s, Jane Goodall arrived in Gombe and started her pioneering research on chimpanzees, redefining our relationships with animals and to ourselves and how we see ourselves in nature. And that work, which she started in 1960, continues to this day in Gombe National Park. We have 2 chimpanzee communities habituated, and every day, every 15 minutes, we're following focal chimpanzees, recording the group size, distribution, interactions, feeding patterns, including also occurrence of disease. Some of the monitoring, like mother-infants, is actually happening every 2 minutes, depending of the behavior. But somewhere in the beginning of 90s, Jane took up a plane over Gombe and realized that, my goodness, 80% of chimpanzee habitat outside the park was gone. And if we look, she also realized that all this land of chimpanzees outside the park actually was the village land. And back then, she realized that there is no chance we can protect this unique and long-term studied chimpanzees if we don't work with people, if we don't address their livelihoods. And in 1994, we started our flagship community conservation centered approach called TACARI. And guess what? When we approached the communities, chimpanzees were not their priorities. They wanted access to education, wanted access to clean water, opportunities for development, and of course health, access to good health. So in one perspective, the One Health approach is coming already through listening to and understanding local communities' needs and the importance of health for developing sustainable livelihoods and landscapes. But it also comes because Gombe habitat is well protected since it's a national park, the major mortality of chimpanzees is actually disease. So it's coming from that perspective as well. Today, the Institute covers the entire chimpanzee range in Africa and actually includes all the other great apes in Africa. And it covers a variety of initiatives, starting from basic research, conservation initiatives, but also we have a strong welfare and some chimpanzee orphanages, like for example in Chimpunga and Congo. We also have a very strong youth education program called Roots and Shoots, which are spreading around the world. We still work at the community level. This is our major focus. And we use technology, including satellites, at very high resolution because of the work with communities to show, for example, how villages like in Kigali in Tanzania, as seen from 50 centimeter resolution satellite imagery, this is how it looked in 2005. You can see deforestation here and the watersheds issues, and how it looks now after successful reforestation. So we use high resolution imagery with the local community to do participatory mapping and together facilitate design of these more sustainable landscapes. But we also leverage NASA's longest ongoing program, Landsat program, to integrate more than 30,000 satellite images in the cloud in order to model and predict chimpanzee habitat health annually from 2000 and currently, and also predict how it's going to look like in the future. If we zoom in back to Gombe, even though it's small, Gombe is an intersection of some really complex dynamics happening there. It's one of the less remnant forests in the Albertine Rift, a section of which is very biodiverse, but it's also very close to DRC and other regions. And the One Health approach, we have a very strong and active group of partners in academia and other government institutions, working on a variety of health issues. For example, some of them has to deal with building the infrastructure in Gombe in order to have the capacity to do proper pathology when we have chimpanzees and other primates, different mortality, and then also to address different issues in dealing with managing and the disease in the population of primates in Gombe. But the latest project, which we start working with the Microsoft research, is taking this to a totally new level, which is really exciting. Well, first of all, the Microsoft Project Premonition, I don't know if you heard about it, but it basically leverages a number of different technologies. I will not mention here drones, but I'll focus on two major ones. And it has to deal, one component is developing a better trap to capturing the insects with a focus on mosquitoes. And another is developing a metagenomic pipeline in the cloud, which allows to analyze some of this data collected by the trap. So the first part, the trap itself, it looks like this. Now, the trap itself is evolving as we are testing it in the field. It looks already a little bit different, the third version, but it's something similar, the same size. It can use a UV as a lure, or a CO2, in this case, is a dry ice kind of source. And again, As I said, the trap itself is evolving, but the principle is pretty similar. I mean, you see it here, each cell has a laser, which are able then to convert the wing beats of the insects into frequencies, and by looking at the light, how that oscillates, capturing that laser and the shadows from the wing beats. And apparently, once you take this data in the cloud, you are able to run all sorts of machine learning algorithms. Different species have very unique frequencies. So this is really fascinating. The second part of it is this metagenomic pipeline. And recently, our colleagues from Microsoft Research and their partners from academia presented this, that actually they were able to successfully identify different mosquito species. They were able to identify the pathogens in the host of the blood meal host of this species, and in some cases even viruses which are not necessarily transmitted by the mosquitoes. They were also able to look at the hosts and identify the hosts, and this is really exciting for us because often we are in remote areas and we have no idea. For us, it would be a very interesting way to maybe sample presence or absence of endangered species, for example, in a non-invasive way, and of course, they get a lot of other data about the microbiota. There are two types of data sets generated by the system. One part of the data set, it has to deal with the phenotypic data about these different species, and it has been collected. It can be collected at the community level, insect community level, or individual species level, and then, of course, once it's trapped, you have this data pipeline on the metagenomic data, which can be extracted from the blood of these mosquitoes. And of course, as a conservation organization, we're very excited that this approach is non-invasive and allows us to collect data from endangered species without disturbing them. The objectives of the Project Premonition in Gombe is kind of digitization at the 4 different levels. We wanted to start with very basic question: if we can use the digital data without even capturing any mosquitoes or insects, just the digital signature. For example, when we deployed it in Gombe, each trap generated per night 4,000 observation data points, and each data point had dozens of variables, including temperature and humidity and all those other variables. So you end up generating this truly big data, which allowed us to analyze it then in the cloud and using deep learning and other machine learning algorithms there. Another question was, well, can we digitize actually species, right? And if we can, then then the trap can make decision to capture the species or not, right? So in this way, increasing maybe the probability of capturing mosquitoes with blood. The third question is focused about can we use then these mosquitoes, the blood from the mosquitoes, as a biodiversity survey tool in terms of to see the presence or absence of this other species. And it's interestingly enough, I mean, we're interested, of course, in mammals, but mosquitoes feed on reptiles and birds, and they are very, so that kind of, it's interesting to us to look at the biodiversity from that prism. And lastly, but really important is, can we detect actually pathogens in the hosts through this data sets and predict maybe some of these zoonotic risks. The deployments in Gombe are done in close collaboration with Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute and Tanzania National Parks and of course, JGI Tanzania researchers. So here are some examples of the ecosystem, some preliminary examples of the first year of testing which we have. This is a beautiful bush viper, which was watching what we're doing there in the forest. No mosquitoes, we didn't detect it yet from the mosquito source, but it was there. So we did place the traps inside Gombe and just outside Gombe National Park. You can see here the boundary with another village. And it was interesting to me that just by simply looking at the digital signature without trapping anything, there is very difficult signature in the village, in the area which is disturbed versus undisturbed habitat. So, I'm very excited about to continue explore and put more traps and more longer periods. When it comes to human and animal health, I mean, of course, Gombe is a very interesting place because there's a lot of human disease and wildlife interactions. As I said, chimpanzee mortality in Gombe is mostly due because of diseases which the source are from the tourists or researchers or local communities. Gombe is a reservoir of an SIV, which, as you all know, and then there is other set of diseases which we don't even look at it because they not necessarily resulted yet into the increasing the mortality of this chimpanzee community. But obviously we're very interested to better understand. And it's interesting again that once you start talking about people's health, people are really excited and interested in the technology and want to see it kind of deployed. Even though Gombe is relatively small, but it's part of very dynamic and complex system. As we are just arriving in the village, in the background you can see back in this was in February, so it was about when in Eastern DRC was another explosion of violence, and you have all this, people fleeing their homes and arriving, crossing the lake, and some of them are processed and will be located in the refugee camps, but many refugees will decide to stay illegally, so there is obviously constantly this movement of people and dynamics in the region, and Gombe is right there in the center of it. We're able to catch around 6 mosquitoes, different type of mosquitoes in Gombe, just for the first testing. And it was interesting that one of the most commonly prevalent mosquito which we found was associated with one of the major chimpanzee food sources, some are comerescens vines. And this is interesting to me because for my 18 years ago, for my own PhD, when I looked at the satellite images and how the vegetation changed and how the chimpanzee feeding changed, the Sabacomerensens exploded inside Gombe because we start controlling the fire. So the Tanzania national parks have been protecting the habitat. They have been doing fire pre-burning. So the habitat start to restore inside the park. And a big part of it was expansion of these vines, which chimpanzees just loved. So suddenly you went from Sabacomerensens being 20% of chimpanzee feeding, time feeding in 70s, to more than 80% part of their food. And they died. So this is really interesting to have this connections, and particularly larvae being in this. You can see them in this in these shells of the fruit. All of them were full of mosquitoes, and it was interesting that most of them were mosquitoes which are larvae are actually predatory on the disease, on other mostly disease mosquitoes for like Culex and Aedes, which would be major vectors interesting for people. So that's ecosystem and dynamics. It's really complex and excited for us to continue to explore. This is just some examples of this Mabungu makuba full of larvae. Here's just an example of a female and a male specimen. And what was interesting to me is that this different type of mosquitoes have unique digital signatures, which it means that we can decide in a split millisecond to capture that mosquito or not. And so you can imagine, again, the options which are giving us in order to better sample the environment using these tools. It also helps us realize that some of the species, like the ones have the wing beaks is actually much more, it's a larger variance in the wing beaks. So it means that you need to tweak and adjust your algorithms, which is totally fine. It's just we didn't realize that there is such a huge variability by species, but this can be planned for. So so we just completed basically the first phase, just bringing a couple of these traps to Gombe and just having an idea how they function in that environment. We're right now focusing on a 3-year project to pretty much build a digital lab in Gombe, which would allow us to do this type of cloud metagenomic and AI analysis and collect this type of data using robotic traps. We're also very excited to look at Gombe long-term data collection to be continued, complemented with a lot of other sensors. So we already have been looking from space and satellites. We want to add that acoustic and camera traps and integrate and look at the sensors as other digital sensors which can be placed in the environment and bring all this data together. We have a partnership with Earth AI program as part of Microsoft and Esri to bring this and this, to leverage in this one geospatial platform in the cloud. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to build the Jane Goodall Institute Tanzania capacity in our Tanzanian institutional capacity to collect data and analyze and manage chimpanzee and human diseases in this very complex ecosystem and dynamic ecosystems. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Hi, Jacqueline Ashker, the co-director of Einstein's Global Health Center. So first of all, this was fascinating and eye-opening to the straightforward human researcher. Very straightforward question. So these traps, you can decide which mosquitoes to capture based on the wing analysis. So consequently, you could reduce a specific mosquito population that transmits diseases to a dangerous level in certain regions without disturbing all the mosquito populations or insect populations, correct? Because this is not really harming the environment. You're not spraying, you're not genetically engineering the mosquitoes. Let's say you have a Zika or whatever new vector-borne disease outbreak. Just to reduce a certain mosquito population, you could use these traps theoretically in a very simple way. So you're presenting an incredible tool that could change world dynamics.
Yes, so theoretically, if you have enough traps, it might be possible. We did not even think about this. But you're right. I mean, this is exactly what this innovative technologies do to different sectors and different groups of, and this is where these innovations then are used and leveraged in a ways which the original maybe developers did not even think about. So this is why it's so exciting for us to work with Microsoft researchers and engineers in Gombe, in conditions which, and look suddenly at Gombe after all these years, look at Gombe in different ways.
I want to
yeah.
my garden.
Okay. Yeah, I think part of the vision, right. Yeah, I mean, we could envision that if you combine this with citizen science project or with, and I think this is part of long-term vision, how maybe some of this robotic sensors can be combined with citizen science and crowdsourcing and actually bring education, build awareness and education in the larger population.
Actually, thanks that you pointed to citizen science, because I was going to mention, and I think I've already briefly mentioned you about this, but there is this initiative in Stanford. I recently met them in IMED with Larry Madoff. So they have this app that is about to come out, I think. It's called A-Buzz, and it's basically, you basically record the sound of insects flying around you, and again, using AI, they identify what is flying around you. So they already doing this with the citizen science model, trying to do this at a global scale and trying to identify diversity and hotspots of potentially vector-borne insects. So
wow.
Transmitting insects. So you should. I'd love to put you. I mean. You can get
no, thank you so much. I would love to. I love the idea of again looking at the sound but measuring in different ways. And of course, one thing which we're very excited is the state where the Internet of Things technologies now evolved, where we can actually set up low-powered network in Gombe or in any remote areas within 30-kilometer radius, which would allow all these different sensors in the environment actually to talk to each other and communicate with a certain server. So once you start thinking this way, yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks.
Thanks, Lilian. Fantastic presentation. Could you share a little bit with the folks here in terms of the Jane Goodall Institute's work? You mentioned Takari there. You may want to share a little bit more about that, because that's really another aspect of One Health in play, and also some of the really innovative work that's happening in Gombe in terms of women's health and girls' health that JGI is leading. Thank you.
Right. Well, thanks, Kit. As I said, even though our objectives and goal is to protect chimpanzees and habitats and other great apes in Africa, if you look at the strategies and actions, they're pretty much One Health approach, because it recognizes not only the complexity of the challenges and issues, but also the importance of empowering and supporting and building the capacity of local stakeholders and users and communities to manage their natural resources and their own lives and their own landscapes. So as a result, we have a quite diverse portfolio of different projects. We're focusing on four major parts. One of them, as I mentioned here, is basic research, and we're continuing research at Gombe, but we're also doing quite an amazing work on physiology and malaria and other work with captive chimps, with captive chimpanzees in our orphanages, in sanctuaries for the orphan chimpanzees. We have a very strong chimpanzee welfare program, because what makes us different from a lot of other conservation organizations is that for us, every individual chimpanzee, we're helping not only chimpanzee population, but every individual chimpanzee. So once we have all these orphan chimps, we end up either placing them in orphanages in our partners, or we have some sanctuaries like Chimpunga, which we manage ourselves. So as part of providing the best care possible and welfare, we have a lot of other research, basic research happening in the sanctuaries. And our director of program in Congo, she's a vet by training, Rebecca Atense. Dr. Atense would be a fantastic contact for people who are interested to learn more about that. Then we have a very strong community-centered conservation, right? And this is basically, it varies village from village. It's not a one approach, but it has a strong education component. It has a health component, access to health. It has a, depending on the community request, it has also a family planning part. Of course, it also has to deal with agroforestry and agriculture. There is some water quality issues, and they all kind of come together when it has to deal with village land use planning, empowering communities to have access to land tenure and security of land tenure and capacity to manage that. And the final component is something which, again, is spreading like fire. It's youth. It's education, youth, roots and shoots, which right now it's in more than 100 countries. And it has to deal with educating this new generation, which all this other work is meaningless if the new generation is not ready to take it to total new level. So thank you.